step back into the forgotten alleys of medieval Paris, where history hides in the shadows. This story follows Eliann, a woman forced into the life of a prostitute, whose daily struggles with filth, disease, and neglect gave birth to a sorrowful lament, a song that echoed far beyond the brothel walls. Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through the medieval times. As you settle in for a moment of peace and relaxation, I invite you to share in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is. I always love seeing how far our community of night owls extends. If you enjoy immersing yourself in the rich tapestry of history to unwind, consider subscribing for more soothing stories like this one. The Street Without Light, Paris, the winter of the 14th century. The city lay beneath a low sky of ash, the air choked with wood smoke and damp fog. In the narrow lanes, mud and waste mingled into foul rivers that trickled between cobblestones. Carts creaked, their wheels sinking into the muck, while the cries of hawkers rose above the din. Hot pies, fresh eels, apples for a penny. Among the crowd, her cloak pulled tightly about her thin frame, walked a young woman named Eliann. She was no older than 20, though her eyes carried the weary weight of someone twice her age. Once she had been a child of the countryside, running barefoot in the grass and washing freely in a brook that sparkled under the summer sun. But hunger and debt had driven her family to despair. Her parents, with little choice, sent her to Paris, where survival meant compromise. The city had offered her only one path, the path of the women who sold themselves in the shadows. The stench of the city. Paris was alive, but not with kindness. The streets reeked of fish left too long in the sun, of tallow smoke, of privies emptied into gutters. Rats skittered openly, bold as cats. Meat sellers hacked at carcasses while their boys shouted prices. And above it all, the bells of Notre Dame tolled in mournful rhythm, reminding the people of salvation, while the streets themselves seemed hellish. Eliann walked past the market square, her stomach twisting at the smell of roasting chestnuts and spiced wine. She had not eaten since dawn, when she chewed a crust of stale bread that had tasted of mold. She touched the small flask hidden in her cloak, not of food, but of cheap wine, sour and biting. It was the only thing she could afford to wash with. A ritual of false cleanliness. In her rented room, little more than a corner above a tavern stable, Eliann would sit by the faint light of a candle. The air reeked of horses, dung, and damp hay. She would soak a rag with the sharp wine and press it against her skin. It stung wherever her flesh was raw, wherever rash or sweat had left its mark. The wine did not cleanse. It only masked. Still, she told herself, it was better than nothing. Her garments clung to her body with old sweat and grime. Washing them was near impossible. Water was costly. Soap, even more so. Sometimes she rubbed her shift with ashes and rinsed it in a pail, but it never truly came clean. At night, when she lay down on her straw mattress, the smell of her own body filled her nose, mingling with the stink of the stable below. The merchant. One evening, the lamps along the Pont au Change flickered in the wind as Eliann lingered on a corner. Mud splashed her skirts, and a drunkard stumbled by, cursing. A figure approached, a merchant, his fur-lined cloak heavy, a golden clasp glittering in the lamplight. He smelled of roasted meat, good wine, and wealth. He looked at her with the cool appraisal of a man weighing goods at market. "Come," he said. "Follow me." He led her through twisting alleys, up a stair into a chamber warmed by a blazing hearth. The air was thick with incense. A silver goblet stood half-drunk on the table, the liquid within richer than anything Eliann had ever tasted. The man smiled, but not at her, at his own indulgence. His hands were certain, practiced. Eliann's body submitted, but inside she screamed, "Am I not more than this? Why must my life be measured in filth and silence? Why am I forgotten before I have even lived?" Her scream made no sound. The merchant never heard it. The tavern. Afterward, she found herself in a tavern on the Rue Saint-Denis. The tavern was noisy, its beams dark with smoke, the air thick with sweat and ale. Men shouted over dice. A fiddler scraped at his instrument in the corner, and women, some like her, some merely desperate wives, bustled between tables with jugs. Eliann sat with Marie, her only true companion in Paris. Marie's face was lined, her teeth worn, but her eyes held a spark of humor. Together they shared a wooden bowl of thin pottage, a rare kindness bought with the last of Eliann's coins. Marie leaned closer, lowering her voice beneath the din. "Do you know what I heard? The noble ladies, wives of merchants and magistrates, they bathe together in scented baths, rose petals on the water, musicians playing while they soak in warmth. Imagine it." Eliann closed her eyes, and for an instant she was elsewhere in a chamber of marble, fragrant steam curling about her face, clean water lapping at her skin. She remembered her childhood brook, remembered splashing under the sun. When she opened her eyes, the tavern stank of stale beer and sweat. Reality returned, bitter as ash. Sunday sermons. On Sundays, she sometimes stood in the back of the cathedral, pressed among beggars and outcasts. The priests thundered from the pulpit, their voices echoing in the stone vaults. They spoke of sin, of women like her, of punishment eternal. Never did they ask why. Never did they question how hunger and ruin drove women to this path. To them, Eliann was a symbol, a warning, never a human being. And the chroniclers, the men who scratched the story of Paris onto parchment, wrote of kings and battles, of plagues and miracles. They did not write of her, or of Marie, or of the countless women who lived in the shadows. Their lives would vanish like smoke, unrecorded, unremembered. Eliann knew this truth. She was voiceless. History did not see her. The last morning. One dawn, frost crept across the glass of her window. Eliann woke with her body aching, as if her bones were made of rust. Each movement hurt. She reached for her rag, soaked it once again in the sour wine, and rubbed her skin. The sting made her eyes water. Tears slipped down her cheeks, mingling with the wine as it dripped to the floor. She thought of Mari, of the noble ladies bathing in rosewater, of the river in her childhood, where she had once been clean and free. She thought of the priest's sermons, the market's noise, the merchant's smile. She thought of her mother's hands, rough with fieldwork, and her father's silence when he had sent her to the city. Her breath grew shallow. The cold seeped into her bones. But deep inside, a flicker of hope burned faintly. One day, someone will tell our story. Someone will remember that we were here, that we suffered, that we longed for water and light. Our silence will not last forever. With that thought, Eliann closed her eyes. Outside, Paris roared on. Merchants shouted, dogs barked, the bells rang, The Seine rolled past, carrying refuse downstream. No one noticed when a young woman's life faded in a rented room above a stable. But her story lingered in the air, like a whisper no one could yet hear, waiting for another age, another voice, to speak it aloud. Ashes of silence. The morning after Eliann's death, Paris awoke in its usual chaos. Market bells rang, carts rattled, and the stench of refuse still clung to the alleys. Life did not pause. The city devoured sorrow as swiftly as it devoured bread. No one inquired about the girl who had lived above the stable. No one, except Mari. Mari's discovery. Mari arrived that morning, carrying a crust of bread to share. She knocked at the wooden door, but there was no answer. Pushing it open, she found the room still and cold. Eliann lay on the straw bed, her face pale, her hands limp upon her chest. The small flask of wine lay tipped on the floor, its contents bleeding into the straw. Mari's breath caught. For a long moment, she stood frozen, unable to cry, unable to move. Then she whispered, almost in disbelief, "Ah, little bird, you are gone." She touched Eliann's cheek. It was already cold. The silence in the room was heavier than any sermon. Mari wept, but only briefly. Tears were a luxury, and she had none to spare. She pulled a tattered cloth over Eliann's body and sat beside her, whispering prayers half remembered from her childhood. The burial of the forgotten. There would be no coffin, no holy mass for a woman like Eliann. Prostitutes were rarely buried in consecrated ground. Their bodies were carried to the outskirts, lowered into shallow earth, their names unspoken. Mari followed the men who carted her friend away, her heart heavy with a mixture of sorrow and fury. She watched as Eliann was laid into the soil, without blessing, without song. Only the crows bore witness. Mari clenched her fists. "They say our voices do not matter," she murmured, "but I will not let her vanish." A city moving on. Paris continued its life without pause. Merchants shouted in the square. Priests thundered in pulpits. Noblewomen glided in silk through the halls. And in the shadows, women like Mari filled the void Eliann had left. Their bodies traded for coin. Their silence thick as smoke. Yet Mari carried Eliann's memory with her. Every time she washed herself with sour wine, she remembered her friend's tears. Every time she heard the priests denounce her kind, she remembered Eliann's silent scream. One night, as she sat in the tavern, Marie spoke softly to another girl, new to the city, frightened and thin. She told her of Eliann not as a sinner, but as a soul who had loved, who had dreamed of water and light. The girl listened, wide-eyed, and for a moment, Eliann lived again in memory. A whisper that grew, and so the story spread. Not in books, not in chronicles, but in whispers between women. One spoke to another, and then another. They remembered Eliann's longing for cleanliness, her dream of rosewater baths, her silent plea for dignity. Her name never reached the parchment of scribes, nor the lips of noblemen. But in the secret sisterhood of forgotten women, Eliann became a symbol. She was one of us, they said, and she will not be erased. The flicker of legacy. Years later, Mari herself grew old. Her hands shook, her eyes dimmed. Yet when young girls came to her for guidance, she always told them of Eliann. She described her gentle smile, her longing for the river, her final morning. She spoke as though Eliann's ghost lingered beside her, listening. One cold evening, As Marie sat alone, she whispered into the silence, "They never wrote your name, little bird." But I did. In the hearts of those who listened, I wrote it. You are not gone. And for the first time in many years, she felt at peace. Ending. Paris swallowed countless voices, countless lives lost in shadow. Yet Eliann's story endured fragile, invisible, but alive in whispers, carried by women who refused to forget. History might never mention her, but she lived on in the memory of those who shared her silence. And sometimes, in the stillness of night, if one listened closely, one could almost hear the faint sound of water, a river flowing in a dream, where Eliann, at last, was clean. The pen and the whisper. The year was drawing toward another winter. Paris, restless and vast, still pulsed with noise, markets brimming with cries, bells tolling over rooftops, taverns spilling laughter and curses into the streets. Yet amid all that clamor, there were always whispers, soft, secret words passed from one woman to another. Words of Eliann, the student. In the cloistered halls of the University of Paris, a young student named Jehan bent over parchment. His task was dull: to copy sermons for his master, line after endless line of admonitions about sin and virtue. His ink-stained fingers cramped. His eyes ached in the candlelight. Jehan often slipped into the taverns at night, seeking noise and distraction. It was in one such tavern, thick with smoke and dice play, that he overheard a voice, a woman, older, speaking softly to a girl at her side. She was called Eliann, the woman whispered, a gentle one, with eyes too sad for her years. She dreamed of water, clean, sweet water, but the city gave her only filth. Jehan's quill hand twitched. He turned, though he did not interrupt. He watched the two women, one hardened, one frightened, and for the first time wondered, who tells their stories? A different kind of history. Back at his desk, Jehan's thoughts strayed. The chronicles he copied told of kings, of wars, of plagues. They painted Paris as a city of grandeur and ruin, but never of the quiet suffering that breathed in its alleys. Never of women, like Eliann. He began, secretly, to scratch words in the margins of his parchment. Not sermons, not decrees, but fragments. She washed herself with sour wine. She longed for a river. Her voice was silence itself. Each line felt dangerous, as though ink could defy the world. Meeting Marie. One evening, Jehan lingered in the tavern again, waiting for the older woman. At last, she appeared to Marie, weary but unbroken, her shawl drawn tight. Gathering his courage, Jehan approached. "Madame," he said softly, "I overheard you once. You spoke of Eliann. Who was she?" Marie's eyes narrowed. She studied him, suspicious. Then she sighed. "Why do you care? Men write their books, priests give their sermons, and women like us vanish. Why should you wish to know?" Jehan's voice was earnest. "Because I believe history is a liar without you." Marie gazed at him for a long time. Then, slowly, she began to speak. She told him of Eliann, her gentleness, her sorrow, her longing for rosewater baths, her final morning in the cold room above the stable. Jehan listened, every word sinking into him like ink into parchment. The written memory. That night, Jehan returned to his chamber. By candlelight, he began to write, not in the margins, but on a fresh sheet. His hand shook as he formed the letters. There was a girl named Eliann who lived in the streets of Paris. She was young, yet old with grief She dreamed of water, but washed herself with wine. She was buried without blessing, but she will not be forgotten. He wrote not as a scribe, but as a witness. For the first time, Eliann's story touched parchment, however fragile, however secret. The risk. Jahan knew what danger he invited. If discovered, his writings might be burned, condemned as sinful indulgence in the tales of fallen women. Yet he could not stop. Each night, he returned to the page, shaping Eliann's life into words, adding Mari's voice beside hers. It was not a great chronicle, not a gilded manuscript destined for kings. It was only a few pages, hidden among his books. But it was enough. A fragment of truth against the silence of centuries. The whisper lives on. Years later, Jahan's manuscripts were scattered, some lost, some ignored. But one page remained, passed quietly from hand to hand, tucked between other writings. It bore no author's name, only the story of a girl and her longing for water. Thus, Eliann's whisper became ink, and ink became memory. She was still absent from the grand histories, still unknown to priests and nobles. Yet in the hidden corners of Paris, where women still whispered her name, a fragile seed had been sown. Paris rolled on, devouring lives and spitting out bones. But Eliann was no longer wholly silent. She lived in whispers, in Marie's trembling voice, and now in the fragile script of a student who believed history was incomplete without her. And somewhere, beyond the noise of the city, perhaps in the gentle rush of the Seine at night, her spirit found the river she had dreamed of, clean, endless, and free. The hidden pages. The winter of Paris crept in, with biting winds that rattled the shutters of the university dormitories. Jahan huddled close to his candle, the fragile sheet before him carrying Eliann's name in trembling ink. He read the words again and again, fearing and yet cherishing them, as if each syllable held a spark of forbidden truth. He hid the pages beneath the covers of a heavy sermon book, a tome thick with holy reproach, the sort no one would willingly disturb. There, between Latin condemnations of lust and warnings of eternal fire, lay the secret life of a girl who had long been buried without a blessing. The first reader. Jahan had a friend, Pierre, another student, restless and curious, who noticed his secrecy. One evening, when Jahan left his chamber in haste for vespers, Pierre's eyes fell upon the half-hidden parchment. Temptation stirred. He slid it free, expecting perhaps a love poem or a blasphemy that could be used for laughter later. But as he read, Pierre's smirk softened. His lips moved silently. She dreamed of water, but washed herself with wine. She was buried without blessing, but she will not be forgotten. The candle guttered. Pierre sat back, stunned by the simplicity. It was not a sermon, not satire, not a tale of knights and glory. It was the voice of a lost woman, fragile as frost. He replaced the page carefully, though a shadow of unease clung to him. That night, while the students jested over ale, Pierre was quiet, the echo of Eliann's story haunting him like a hymn half-remembered. Whispers among scholars. In the weeks that followed, Pierre betrayed Jahan's secret, not through malice, but by accident. Over late-night wine, he murmured of a strange writing about a prostitute, a sad little tale. His companions laughed at first, but one or two grew curious. Soon, whispers drifted through the dormitory like smoke. Jahan writes stories of fallen women. Some mocked, Others, secretly, wanted to read. But Jehan, realizing his pages had been seen, grew fearful. He clutched the parchment closer, sleeping with the sermon book under his pillow, as though guarding a relic. The choice. One bitter evening, Jehan and Mari met again in the tavern. Her shawl smelled faintly of smoke. Her hands were rough from washing linens in cold water. "They know," Jehan confessed, his voice low. "Other students whisper of what I have written. They call it sinful folly." Mari studied him, her tired eyes steady. "And perhaps it is working," she said. "If they whisper, they remember. If they remember, she is not lost." Jehan's chest tightened. "But if the masters find out, I will be expelled, perhaps worse. The pages could be burned." Mari leaned closer, her voice almost a breath. "Words are like seeds, boy. Plant them well, and even fire cannot destroy them all." That night, Jehan copied Eliann's tale onto 2 more scraps of parchment. One he kept. The other he folded tightly and placed beneath the loose stone in the tavern's hearth, where only Mari would know to find it. Thus, the story of Eliann began to multiply, fragile as paper, yet stubborn as weeds breaking through stone. Her silence was no longer entire. She had begun to haunt the city, not with wails, but with whispers written in ink, scattered like seeds across the cold soil of Paris. The monk's dilemma. The frost of January lay heavy upon Paris. Snow gathered in the gutters, turning the narrow lanes into winding corridors of ice. At dawn, bells tolled across the city, calling the faithful to prayer, their echoes rising like breath from the stone heart of Notre Dame. Inside a monastery near the river, Brother Anselm, a monk of middle years, bent over his work. He was a patient man, devoted to copying scripture in careful hand. The smell of ink and vellum clung to his robes more than incense. For him, every page was a ladder toward salvation. The lost page. One morning, as he walked through the streets to gather parchment from a stationer, the wind caught at a loose scrap lying in the gutter. He stooped, intending to discard it, but his eyes caught the words, written in a young hand. Her body was a market, but her soul hungered for prayer. She longed for clean water, but washed herself in wine. Anselm froze. He read further, lips moving silently. The text was no scripture, no saint's tale. It was something else, entirely a confession not his own, yet drenched with grief. For the first time in years, the monk felt his throat tighten. He folded the scrap carefully and slipped it into his sleeve. Between sin and compassion. That evening, in the quiet of his chamber, Brother Anselm read the page again by the glow of a tallow candle. The words throbbed with a humanity rarely admitted in holy books. A woman's life, raw, shame-stained, yet painfully tender, whispered to him from beyond the grave. He muttered a prayer for her soul, yet when he tried to place the page aside, he found himself unable. If I burn it, I kill her twice, he thought. If I keep it, am I complicit in sin? His fingers trembled. He had been taught that prostitutes were lost, unworthy of memory, mere examples of vice. Yet here was memory itself, refusing to die. Confession in the cloister. A few days later, Anselm sought counsel with Father Guillaume, a stern superior. "I found a writing," Anselm began. "It tells of a woman's shameful life, yet in such a way that pity clings to the soul. What is the proper course?" Guillaume frowned. "Cast it to the fire. These words tempt compassion where only judgment is due. The wages of sin are death. Let it be so. Anselm bowed his head outwardly, but inside unease gnawed at him. For when he prayed that night, it was not Christ's face that filled his vision, but a nameless girl's, pale, weary, longing for absolution. The hidden copy. Unable to obey fully, Brother Anselm did something dangerous. Before dawn, he took fresh parchment and copied the words carefully in his practiced hand. He made small changes disguising the tone, softening the details, but the essence remained. He hid this copy inside the margins of the Book of Sermons, buried beneath layers of pious instruction. Perhaps, he whispered, someday another will read and pray for her soul. Thus, Eliann's story survived once more, now sheltered not only by a tavern maid and a young scholar, but also by a reluctant monk, torn between obedience and mercy. Outside, the bells rang again, summoning Paris to worship. But within the cloister, Brother Anselm lingered over the hidden page, uncertain whether he had sinned or served God. And in that uncertainty, Eliann's voice, fragile yet enduring, pressed deeper into the cracks of history, refusing to be silenced. The baker's wife. The streets of Paris awoke not with bells, but with the smell of bread. At dawn, smoke curled from chimneys above the Rue des Marmousets, where bakers fired their ovens. Flour dusted the air like pale snow, clinging to the hair and lashes of the women who kneaded the dough. Among them worked Isabeau, a stout baker's wife, with hands hardened by years of kneading. She rose long before light, shaping loaves while her children still dreamed. Her life was bound to fire, flour, and the endless rhythm of hunger in the city. A chance discovery. One afternoon, while buying old parchment from a student to wrap spice cakes, Isabeau noticed that one scrap bore careful writing instead of the usual numbers or prayers. She almost crumpled it, but her eyes paused upon the ink. She scrubbed her skin with wine, yet could not cleanse the ache of loneliness. She walked the streets, despised, yet still wished for kindness and a single glance. Isabeau frowned, heart tugging strangely. These were not the words of a priest, nor the instructions of a doctor. They sounded like a woman. She folded the scrap into her apron and carried it home. Night in the bakery. That night, after the ovens cooled and her children slept, Isabeau sat by the embers and read the words again. She was no scholar, yet she could read enough to understand. The woman described, poor, scorned, struggling for dignity, did not seem distant. Isabeau whispered, "I know you." She remembered the girls she saw at the edge of the marketplace, painted lips, tired eyes, standing in the cold, waiting for men who never spoke their names. She had often pitied them silently, though never dared to show it aloud. Now, here was one of their voices, trapped upon the page. A quiet prayer. For days, Isabeau kept the scrap hidden beneath the flour sacks. Whenever her back ached or her heart grew weary of endless work, she pulled it out and read again. It was as if the woman on the page sat beside her, whispering, reminding her that even the most despised longed for warmth. One Sunday, in the crowded church, Isabeau did something unusual. When the priest spoke of fallen women, condemning them to eternal fire, she lowered her head, but not in agreement. She whispered a silent prayer for the unknown soul, asking mercy for her as she would for herself. The bread, and the word. One evening, a neighbor asked for bread on credit. Isabeau wrapped the loaf in a scrap of parchment, but by mistake, she used the precious one, the page with the woman's words. The neighbor, a weaver's apprentice, discovered it later and passed it around among his fellows, laughing at the sad poetry of some whore. Isabeau's cheeks burned when she heard. Yet beneath her shame was something fiercer, a quiet conviction that the words, once freed, would travel further than flour sacks and oven smoke. Perhaps ridicule was only another kind of survival. And so, through the hands of a baker's wife, Eliann's voice escaped once more from cloister to kitchen, from hidden prayer to common talk. Even mocked, it remained alive, weaving itself into the fabric of daily life in Paris, where bread and words alike were carried from hand to hand, never wholly consumed. The minstrel's song. The streets of Paris never lacked voices. Priests thundered from pulpits, merchants cried their prices, children sang crude rhymes in the alleyways. Yet among them all, none gathered listeners more swiftly than a wandering minstrel with a lute strapped across his back. His name was Arnaut, a Gascon with nimble fingers and a voice that could be tender or mocking as the crowd demanded. He wandered from inn to inn, earning his bread with songs of knights, lovers, and saints. A scrap in the marketplace. One gray afternoon, Arnaut stopped near the Pont au Change. There, among the bustle of traders, he was handed a parchment by a laughing weaver's boy. Sing this, minstrel. The words of some sad drab who thought herself a poet. The boy's friends jeered, but Arnaut glanced at the lines, lips moving silently. Even in filth, I dream of rivers. Even despised, I hope for a hand that does not strike. He said nothing to the lads. He only folded the parchment and tucked it beneath the strings of his lute. The first performance. That night, in a smoky tavern, Arnaut tuned his instrument, and instead of the usual bawdy tale, he wove those words into a melody. He softened them, stretching the syllables into lament. The crowd expected laughter, but instead they fell silent. A washerwoman at the back crossed herself. A soldier stared into his mug. One old man muttered, "That was my sister once." Arnaut ended with no flourish, bowing his head. The room remained hushed, as though a ghost had passed among them. From tavern to road, word spread. Some mocked the whore's ballad, others demanded to hear it again. By the next week, Arnaut was singing it in Chartres, and by the next month, in Orléans. The verses changed as they traveled a line lost. Another added, but the heart remained, a woman's yearning for dignity amid scorn. Farmers' daughters hummed it while drawing water. Soldiers whistled it by their campfires. It slipped from lips to lips, nameless yet alive. The minstrel's reflection. One night, camped beside the Loire, Arnaut sat alone by the embers. He read the parchment once more by firelight, tracing the crooked ink strokes. "Who were you, woman of Paris?" he murmured. "They laughed at your sorrow, yet I have made them weep with it. Perhaps this is your revenge." He tucked the parchment into his pouch, alongside letters and coins. But unlike the others, he never parted with it. Thus, the voice of Eliann, once whispered in secret, now drifted in the air like music. No longer bound to one body, no longer silenced by shame, it became what it had always longed to be, heard. And so the city that had despised her began, unwittingly, to remember her not as a woman, not as a name, but as a song that carried both sorrow and strange beauty through the night. The priest's unease. The bells of Notre Dame tolled across Paris, their iron voices carrying over rooftops and alleyways. Inside the cloisters, where incense veiled the air, and candlelight trembled against stone, a whisper of the new song had reached the ears of the priests. It was said a wandering minstrel sang words born from the mouth of a femme de mauvaise vie, a prostitute's lament, now passing from tavern to tavern, lips to lips, hearts to hearts. A meeting in the chapter house. Canon Guillaume, gray-bearded and stern, pounded his fist upon the wooden table. "This is indecent," he declared. "Paris will be poisoned if the laments of harlots are sung as though they were psalms." Another priest, younger, lowered his gaze. "And yet, Father, the people listen. They listen more than they do to our sermons." Silence followed his words, broken only by the rustle of parchments. The truth sat heavily among them. The streets cared more for one woman's sorrowful melody than for the words of Scripture thundered from the pulpit. An attempt to silence the song. Orders were given. Taverns were warned. Minstrels were threatened with the stocks should they dare sing the verses again. Scribes were told to burn any parchment carrying the lines. But the words had already seeped deep into memory. A washerwoman could hum them while scrubbing linens. A soldier could whistle them on the march. A child could murmur them as a cradle tune. How do you silence what has taken root in the breath of a city? The confessor's doubt. One priest, Father Anselm, sat alone that evening, listening to the faint hum of the song drifting from the quay below. He clasped his rosary, yet his thoughts wandered. "Is it truly dangerous," he whispered, "to give voice to the forgotten? Or do we fear it because it reveals the misery we ourselves ignored?" His lips trembled with the tune. He stopped himself quickly, crossing his chest, but the melody lingered, refusing to vanish. Thus, the church sought to bury the song, branding it shameful, unholy, unfit for Christian ears. Yet the more they pressed, the more it escaped their grasp, fluttering like a bird no hand could cage. And so, the voice of Eliann, born in dirt, and sorrow now echoed, even in the halls that most feared it. A song in the shadows. The winter of that year was cruel in Paris. Snow lay like pale ash upon the rooftops, and the Seine moved sluggishly under sheets of ice. The poor huddled in doorways, burning scraps of wood in cracked clay bowls, while the wealthier folk shut themselves behind heavy doors of oak. And yet, in this season of silence, the forbidden song continued to live. The weaver's wife. In a cramped room near Rue Saint-Denis, a weaver's wife bent over her loom. Her fingers moved slowly, the threads stiff in the cold. Beside her, a little girl, no more than 6 years old, hummed softly. The mother froze. She recognized the tune, the lament of the prostitute, the song the priests had condemned. "Child, where did you hear this?" she whispered. The girl blinked with wide innocence. "The laundress sang it, Maman. She said it keeps her hands from aching." The woman shivered, but she did not hush her daughter. Instead, she let the girl hum, and as the loom creaked, the melody wove itself into the cloth, line by line, thread by thread. At the market. On market days, when peasants from the countryside filled the squares with cabbages, turnips, and salted fish, the song slipped quietly through the noise. A boy selling onions whistled it under his breath. An old beggar murmured it while shaking his cup. Once 2 soldiers passed by and scowled. "Careful with that tune," one muttered. "The bishop's men don't take kindly to it." But the beggar only grinned, toothless, and croaked the refrain louder, as though daring the city to punish a man already half dead with hunger. The soldiers moved on, muttering, yet more than one woman carrying baskets caught herself humming along. The secret gatherings. In the dark of night, behind shuttered windows, women gathered. Not noble women, they had their own gilded sorrows, but the wives of cobblers, the widows of stonemasons, the daughters of washerwomen. They would sit together by the glow of a single candle, sharing crusts of bread, mending worn skirts, and whispering stories. And always, before the night was over, one of them would begin the song. At first, softly, just the first verse, fragile as a moth's wing. Then another voice joined, and another, until the tiny room trembled with a harmony, not of training, but of shared ache. For in Eliann's lament, they heard not only the sorrow of prostitutes, but their own. The endless toil, the hunger, the way men's hands could bruise, how priests could condemn, how the world could forget a woman's name once her youth had faded. The song gave them no cure, but it gave them recognition. And in that recognition, a strange comfort. The priest's sermon. On the feast of St. Agnes, Father Guillaume mounted the pulpit. His voice rang stern through the nave. "There's a song among you," he thundered, "a song of filth and shame. Know this, the devil clothes himself in music to lure you from the path of salvation." The congregation shifted uneasily. Mothers glanced at daughters. Men coughed into their hands. But when the sermon ended, and people filed out into the cold air, a boy tugged at his sister's sleeve and whispered the tune in her ear. She giggled. Their mother hushed them, but the sound lingered, more alive than the priest's furious words. The minstrel again. One night, in a smoky tavern by the river, the wandering minstrel Jehan, the very student who had once set Eliann's words to melody, lifted his lute again. "I was warned," he told the drinkers, "that to play this song is to court punishment. But punish me if you must. The song belongs not to me, nor to you, nor even to the priests. It belongs to her." He strummed the first chord. The room fell silent, and as he sang, rough voices joined him, masons, sailors, washerwomen, and the weary whores themselves. The tavern walls seemed to pulse with the sound until even the rafters trembled. A candle in the convent. Far across the city, in the stillness of a convent dormitory, a novice lay awake. She had once lived in the streets near the brothels of Rue de la Mortellerie. She remembered the stench, the hunger, the shame. When the other sisters slept, she dared to hum Eliann's song under her breath, her hands pressed together in prayer. "Forgive me," she whispered to the dark, but her sorrow feels closer to truth than the sermons ever did. And the candle beside her bed seemed to flicker in agreement. The people's prayer. Weeks passed. The more the church forbade the song, the deeper it rooted itself. Mothers sang it as lullabies. Laborers whistled it as they carried stones. Old women crooned it while combing lice from their grandchildren's hair. It became less a song, more a breath shared by the city. Not holy, not profane, something in between, as though Paris itself had found a way to speak the pain of its women through a melody. Even men who scorned the brothels found themselves struck by its refrain in the dead of night, a tune too sorrowful to be ignored. too human to be denied. Thus Eliann, the forgotten prostitute who once bathed in sour wine and slept on straw, had given Paris a hymn. Not the polished hymn of the cathedral, but a hymn of dirt, of hunger, of bruises and small mercies. And though priests raged and threatened, the city would not let it die. For it was no longer a song alone, it was a mirror, and all who heard it saw themselves reflected in its fragile sorrow. And in the hidden corners of Paris, under the shadow of towers and the weight of winter, the people began to treat it not as blasphemy, but as prayer